put that math into practice and look at what I actually did, how I actually swatched, what decisions I made at each step of the way to see how this math can actually help you make decisions and hopefully predict what size of sweater you're going to end up knitting based on whatever gauge you're getting. A quick caveat before I jump into the actual meat of this video, my swatching is not best practice. These are a bit closer, these are closer to best practice than this one is certainly, but just, you know, I did all of this swatching before I intended to make any kind of video like this. If I knew that I was making a video like this where I was showing off my swatches, I probably would have broken the rules a little bit less, done some more ideal swatching, but really, the farther you are off best practice for swatching, what you're doing is increasing your margin of error. I am all right with the margin of error that I am introducing by being imperfect in my swatching, and that's, you know, that's a balance that I'm happy with. But just to say, especially with my first swatching, you know, this is knit flat, the garment is knit in the round. This is plain stockinette, non-color work. The garment is obviously color work. And I've done this on with two different needles, so they're each these tiny little strips. They're nowhere near big enough to give me truly accurate results. So this one especially is really, really not best practice. These ones are better, but should probably be bigger. So just to flag my own kind of naughtiness before we jump in and look at the math together. I mentioned in a previous part of this series, I believe in part 2, that based on my previous patterns, my experience with what tends to give me a fabric that I'm happy with, I decided to knit at least one of my early swatches with a 4mm needle. That's going up 0.5 millimeter from the needle size that Teddy Lutzak recommends in her pattern. She recommends that you use a 3.5mm needle, and going up by 0.5 millimeter usually, not always, because of course pattern designers are not consistent in their gauges across the board either, but usually that tends to give me a fabric that I'm happy with, or is at least a good place to start. Because I also know, however, that, you know, I'm not just changing the fabric here, I really want this to be a smaller garment than what it would be if I knit at gauge. I'm planning to knit size 2. Size 2 in the pattern, according to the pattern gauge, ends up being 44¼ inches. I want it to be significantly smaller than that. So in this case, and unusually for me, I also decided to swatch initially with the exact needle that Teddy Lutzak calls for. I decided to swatch with 3.5mm needles as well as with 4mm needles. So let's jump right into the results that I get from that once I've blocked the swatch and laid it out and let it dry completely the way that I intend to treat my sweater when I'm finished with it. So the 3.5mm needle gives me quite a dense fabric, and the gauge that I get when I measure that is 27 stitches by 40 rows over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Now right off the bat, I have a concern with that. I'm happy with the stitch gauge. I want the stitch gauge to be quite a bit smaller than Teddy Lutzak's stitch gauge, but the row gauge is raising a bit of a red flag for me. If you remember, Teddy Lutzak's gauge is 24 stitches by 26 rows. My gauge being 40 rows puts me 14 rows off of her row gauge. Row gauge is usually easier to fudge, easier to compensate for on the go as you knit a pattern, so it's always something that I look at secondarily. It's not my main focus when I'm swatching and doing this kind of math, but being 14 rows off over 4 inches is a concern for me, because at the very least that means that I'm going to use a lot more yarn. That's going to mean many more rows to get the dimension of sweater that I want, and it's going to eat up yarn way more than I predicted it would. At this stage I've already bought my yarn, and I bought it in Canada and they don't deliver here, so there's no way for me to order extra yarn. So in this case in particular, that's a big red flag for me. I'm worried about that. I'm also a bit concerned that the fabric is a bit dense. It feels a bit thick for me, even though my preference is for a dense fabric in most cases. But it feels a bit dense for me, and I'm conscious that this is only single thick, and the garment itself is going to be double thick everywhere that there's color work. And there's a lot of color work. So even before I do the math, this swatch is telling me that I'm probably not going to knit this sweater with a 3.5mm needle, but I do the math anyways. So I'm plugging this into the same equation that we were looking at in the previous section of this series, and I'm taking 266 stitches. That, you will remember, is the measurement that we either get from the pattern, or I show you in the previous section how to calculate for that. When we calculated for that, we got 265.5. I've just rounded that up so that it's a round number for me. You could keep it as a decimal point for, greater accuracy at this stage. Designers are often rounding, which is why I decide to round. It's this is where the imperfection comes in, unless you've actually bought the pattern and can find the exact number of stitches. But I've rounded up because in the usual convention of if it's 0.5 or higher, your decimal point, you round up. So that's where I'm getting the 266 stitches from. So 266 stitches times 4 inches divided by my stitch gauge, which is 27 stitches, and that gives me a predicted final garment bust dimension of 39.4 inches. That's actually a great size. That's exactly where I was hoping to be with this sweater. I really wanted to be somewhere around my autumn alpine, which I've been wearing in other sections of this video. That comes in just over 39 inches, probably closer to 39.25 than to 39.4. The Bighorn sheep sweater, which I'm wearing right now, which I designed myself, this one comes in at bang on 40 inches, and I'm really happy with that area. So the math tells me that this would give me a size of sweater that I would be really, really happy with. But because of the row gauge and because of the density of the fabric, I've actually decided at this stage, I'm deciding to count the 3.5mm needle out. That's a little bit sad because it means that I probably won't end up with a sweater that is exactly the size that I want, but all things being taken into account, that's the decision that I make at this stage. So let's move on to the 4mm needle. The 4mm needle gives me a gauge of 25.5 stitches by 36 rows. 36 rows is still a fairly tight row gauge, but it sounds a lot less scary to me than the 40 inches that I had on the 3.5mm needle. I'm happy with this fabric. I'm definitely, I think, happier with this fabric than with the 3.5mm needle. So I move on to the math without too many big concerns. 266 stitches times 4 inches divided by 25.5 stitches gives me a predicted final bust dimension of 41.725 inches. That's at the upper end of what Teddy Litzak recommends as positive ease in this pattern. If you remember, she recommends 4 to 6 inches of positive ease. I have a 36-inch bust, so 6 inches of positive ease for me would be 42 inches. I'm kind of just below that with 41.725. And it's definitely a bit bigger than what I would really like this sweater to be, but where I, had serious concerns that meant that I counted the 3.5mm needle out, I'm less concerned about the 4mm needle, and though a 42-inch sweater wouldn't be perfect, I think I would still really enjoy that. So I've got some good information, some interesting information to send me into my next stage of swatching. In my next stage of swatching, I do a bit more best practice. The reason that I switch at this stage to a kind of better practice of swatching is that I initially at least have an idea that I might only have to do one of these swatches. I have a clearer idea of where I'm headed. I did end up doing 2, but that was really more for peace of mind because this sweater is a little bit more complicated. I'm knitting a bit farther off gauge than I usually do, and I have more of a fixed idea of what I want than usual. But in general, I would only do one of these swatches. So this swatch is better practice right off the bat. It's knit in the round, it's knit in the colorwork motif of the sweater, so it's knit in pattern in the round. It's bigger. It could still stand to be bigger than it is, but we're getting there. We're closer to best practice than we were before. So the first swatch that I decide to do is to split the difference, actually, between the needles that I used before. The 3.5mm needle was too small. The 4mm needle was a bit big, so I did my first colorwork swatch on 3.75mm needles. Now, this swatch is a little bit peculiar. And it's a little bit peculiar in a way that means I almost wanted to re-knit it before I filmed this video, even though I'd done all my math, I'd made all my decisions, I'm already working on, my revised version. I've already restarted the sweater based on all of the math that I've done. So I don't need a new swatch, but I was tempted to do a new swatch just to not show you how peculiar this swatch is. And I've decided instead to share it because this does happen to me, and I'm sure that it happens to some of you, right? We are not machines, we are imperfect, things affect our gauge. So the way that this swatch is peculiar, you can see here, is that it is tighter at the top than it is at the bottom. Especially in these first kind of 4 rounds of white motif, it's pulling in, it's quite a bit tighter than down at the bottom of the swatch. I shared in the first video where I talked about working on my Polina pullover that I was knitting these swatches and casting on during a week of fairly acute stress, and my hands react to my stress, my health in general reacts to my stress, as I know is true for many of us. There are a lot of reasons to be stressed right now. There are lots of things going on in the world, and we had some kind of personal family stress that was acute. So my guess with this swatch, once I saw what had happened, my guess was that I started off knitting too tightly, knitting tighter than I normally would because of that stress, and that I settled into a more normal, quote-unquote, normal gauge for myself as I started knitting because I find knitting calming. That has actually proved true because I knit version 1 all the way down to the bottom of the yoke and then blocked it to see where I stood. I was actually able to confirm this gauge almost with a kind of finished garment more, on a big scale, the full garment, and I did end up with the bigger gauge, so that ended up being true, but all of the decisions I was making at this stage, I was making not knowing it, not being able to pinpoint exactly why it was tighter, right? So what I did was I decided to do math for both of these sections. So at the top of this swatch, where it is a bit tighter, I'm coming in at 28 stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters. Whereas at the bottom, kind of the bottom 3/4 of the swatch, I'm coming in at 26 stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And across the whole swatch, I'm coming in at 30 rows. So I've got 2 gauges here, 28 stitches by 30 rows and 26 stitches by 30 rows. And I decided to do the math for both. Plugging in the tighter gauge first, I do 266 stitches times 4 inches divided by 28, which gives me 38 inches. That's a bit on the small side. I would prefer to have a sweater that's a little bit bigger than that, but if I ended up with a 38-inch sweater, I would be okay. That would work, and I'm sure I would end up loving it. That's in a window that I'm happy with. The second stitch gauge, the 26 stitch gauge, I plug in again to the same formula, 266 times 4 divided by 26 gives me a final predicted bust dimension of 40.92 inches. That's maybe a little bit bigger than I was hoping for, but I actually prefer that to the 38. I think I'd rather have a 41-inch sweater than a 38-inch sweater, and if I, in some margin of error, if I'm wrong and something else was going on with my gauge, I would kind of be happy with a sweater anywhere in that range. So that's positive for me. That tells me that the 3.75mm needle is probably what I'm going to use. That would work really well. Because of these issues with gauge though, and because I realized as soon as I kind of pressed this into the water, I got enough distance as soon as I was pressing it into the water, and I wasn't thinking about the actual swatching anymore, and I was just looking at the motif. I shared before that I looked at it and I just couldn't help but see the kind of old retro flowers from the Nintendo Mario Brothers games, the old versions of those. And that's a positive association for me. I'm not a big video game person, but I don't have negative associations with any of that. It's not what I was going for with this sweater though. So for that reason, really more than anything, but also just because, I had been happy with the 4mm swatch here. I thought it was worth checking this out. I decided to also swatch with 4mm needles. And that gave me a gauge of 25 stitches by 29.5, 29, 30 rows, somewhere in that neighborhood. Right off the bat, I'm not fussed by a difference of 1 or half a row, right? The row gauge on this was 30, the row gauge on this is somewhere 29 to 30, so that's negligible to me. I'm not fussed about that. I will actually talk about row gauge in the next section because I ended up having some trouble with yoke depth based on row gauge and based probably on my height, so I will talk about that in the next section of the video. But at this stage, when I'm swatching and making my decisions, that actually is enough information that I decided to put row gauge to the side. The row gauge is more or less the same. It's not going to impact my decision in this case. So let's look at stitch gauge. I plug 25 stitches into the same formula we've been using over and over again. 266 stitches times 4 inches divided by 25 stitches gives me 42.56 inches. That's, again, a bit bigger than I want. I'm happy with that fabric, but I don't love that fabric more than I love this fabric. All other things being even, I might have had a slight preference for the 4mm fabric, but I'm still really happy with the 3.75mm fabric, and I am much happier with the predicted sweater sizes, even though there are 2 of them, that the 3.75mm sweater gauge is giving me, than the 4mm. Even if I'm looking at the extremes of the gauges I've gotten here, so the smallest gauge on the 3.75mm needle versus the 4mm needle, I think that I would rather end up with a 38-inch sweater than with a 42.5-inch sweater. I'm envisioning wearing this in the spring and early summer, as well as in the winter. I'm envisioning wearing it probably with slightly thinner layers underneath than I do with some of my other sweaters. This is a heavy duty, really warm, I'll wear good thick things under this. I'm not necessarily planning to do the same thing with this, so that's part of why I want this sweater to be on the smaller side. I think even though 38 inches is a bit smaller than I really ideally want, I'd rather end up with 38 inches than with 42.56 inches. So that makes my decision for me. I'm not getting the best of all worlds. It's not exactly perfect, and that way I think that all of this swatching and all of this math is a really good indication of how much you can do to get your ideal fabric and your ideal fit. It's not always possible to get both of those things exactly where you want them, just because of the constraints of the actual patterns that we're working with, but it certainly has helped me to end up with both a fabric that I'm happier with and with a predicted final bust dimension that I'm happier with than I would have been if I just was really trying to get bang on gauge and knitting the pattern as is, right? I will be knitting size 2, and I would way rather have a garment that ends up being 41 inches than a garment that ends up being 44.25 inches, the way that Teddy Lutzak's pattern indicates. One more thing that you might want to do at this stage, and which I always do for the upper arm circumference at a minimum, is to take the same math that we've been doing over and over again and apply it to other dimensions in the sweater. This I think is helpful to do especially for upper arm circumference, and especially if you're making the sweater smaller rather than bigger, because the current trend tends to be to have more positive ease on the body than you have on the arms. So you can take away some of the positive ease on certain sweater patterns and still have a roomy sweater, but the arms might end up being quite tight. This isn't true across the board, and you'll want to take other considerations into sweaters that balance their positive ease or negative ease in different ways, but certainly in my experience, the kind of sweaters that I like to knit, that tends to be the pattern. So I always check upper arm circumference. As you can see, I haven't been doing this every step of the way. I'm definitely more interested in getting a bust circumference that I'm really happy with, because there are things you can do to mediate or change an upper arm circumference if you need to, right? You could change the pattern, you could add in some stitches. In the case of Teddy Lutzak's pattern, it's quite distinct motifs on the arms, so where I didn't want to add extra stitches in between the motifs to extend the size in the yoke, because that makes everything complicated later, there's no more color work after that first bit of color work on the sleeve. So actually, if the sleeve ended up being too tight, adding in more stitches between the motifs is probably what I would have done. In this case, that wasn't something I ended up having to worry about. I have dinky little arms, and this didn't change anything for me at all, but I think that it's worth noting that this is something you might want to do, and the formula is going to look exactly the same. You're just going to swap out, instead of the number of stitches at the bust, you'll swap out, in this case for upper arm circumference, the number of stitches at the upper arm, and plug that into the same formula we've been looking at again and again, and then you'll want to measure your own arm and see if that's a dimension that you're happy with. This is another case where the more information a pattern designer gives you up front, the more decisions you can make before you cast on, before you even necessarily have to buy the pattern. Upper arm circumference is a dimension that Teddy Lutzak gives us. She gives us that lovely schematic, but not all designers do this, so sometimes that's a calculation that you have to wait to do until you own the pattern. But that one I would do at a minimum, and then really you can do that with any other dimensions that you want to do, right? If you're given vertical dimensions, you can use the same math we've been looking at to calculate what your row dimensions will be, what your vertical dimensions will be based on your row gauge. I'll give you an example of this in part 5 of this video. In the next section of the video, I do some of that so that you can see that. Well, I do it because I needed to do it, but you can also see that. So the more information that the designer gives you, the more of this you can do. And especially if there are parts of sweaters that you usually struggle with, parts that tend to be too loose on you or too tight on you, too long or too short, this is where you might want to do some of that additional calculating. Again, for myself, I tend to make my decision based on the bust dimension because that is the dimension that most sweater designers are using as their base, but more information is better, and you can find your own comfort zone for how much of this you want to do. So that's how I proceed from here. I've picked my needle, I have an idea of what fabric I'm going to end up with, I have an idea of what finished garment size I'm going to end up with. I'm pretty happy with most of that. It's not an ideal situation, it's not exactly what I would have done if I was, if I had complete control over changing all of this, but given the pattern and given the restrictions of wanting to keep the pattern looking the way the pattern looks, I'm pretty darned happy with what this has given me, and I'm ready at this stage to properly cast on.